Good afternoon. Today we will discuss about restricted substances in apparel and how to manage these restricted substances for compliance. Now, when you are talking about the restricted substances, first point comes why they are restricted and how the restriction has come. Now, in that we will first see what are the practices for restricted substances compliance, and in that first point which comes here, that is the appointment of a product safety or compliance manager in a factory. Very important in order to ensure the RSL compliance in a factory. The appointment of a proper RSL manager or the safety or compliance manager is required, and there are certain features available for this appointment of this product safety and compliance manager, because he is actually responsible for restricted substances related all the issues happens in the factory for apparel or the accessories. That's why the qualification and capabilities of that compliance manager is very important here, because he has to understand what is RSL. Now, in order to do that compliance manager should have that educational background, that chemistry or textile processing. He should have a good interpersonal skill or training, because he has to communicate down the line. Also, he has to communicate to the purchase department, suppliers and all other stakeholders, and eventually the buyers. So, his knowledge and experience is very important to control the RSL related issues in a factory, and he has an important role to play here. So, those kind of roles include the collection of the data, information, then analysis of those informations or the data available, and then finally the communication with the factory, communication with the team who are engaged in processing, communication with the different stakeholders, suppliers of chemicals, then finally communication with the buyers. So, those are the important roles and responsibility one safety or compliance manager has to play, because he has to establish the RSL program inside a factory. So, his role is very important, and this role also contains that communication is very important. The data what he is getting about the different chemicals or substances, he has to analyze those, and after analysis he has to communicate the data to the different stakeholders in the factory. So, this is one of the important roles that's why he has to play. He has to do the proper record keeping of all the chemicals over a period of time, and also the chemical management systems, that he has a thorough understanding always on this management system, and he has to also conduct a lot of training programs inside the factory who are handling the chemicals, who are using that in different processing like dyeing, printing or finishing operations. So, his roles and responsibilities are very important. Now, another important aspects of this RSL compliance is that implementation of good purchase practices. What we purchase, that is very important, and from where you are purchasing. That's why this part makes an important role while doing the purchase practices inside the factory, and we have to really go into the details of the restricted substances and which are restricted by the brand, and we have to ensure the conformation with this, and so that this total chemical related management is regulated by the particular brand. Now, in the purchase department, there are a lot of chemicals and substances are getting purchased. So, communication is very important here about the chemicals and the raw material suppliers. So, those people, they must know which is banned and which is restricted in the processes. Finally, purchase department also has to give certain kind of declaration kind of thing when they are purchasing some material from some different kind of clients, different kind of suppliers. that the restricted substances declaration, compliance declaration is very important. Okay, they must get the certificate that these substances or chemical is not a restricted substances or harmful substances. Now, maintain and study. This is also very important of chemical related documentations, and there is a thorough understanding must be there inside the factory about the brand restricted substances list. So, all these chemicals or the different substances which are used in the factory, that is regulated by the brand. So, different chemicals and the substances, that's why are to be documented, their behavior, their chemical formulation, etc. So, that maintenance and study is very much important to get the RSL compliance in a factory. And it must be updated. This is a very dynamic list kind of thing. RSL list is getting updated on regular basis by the brand. Okay, so new chemicals are coming into different processes, and we need to study the safety data sheet of all the chemicals, and also the technical data sheet plays an important role to it. So, what are the important features of those chemicals and what is the application methods of those chemicals? So, documentation plays an important role here, and it must be updated on a regular basis. Now, next comes the chemicals related documentation. What do you mean by chemical related documentations? Now, in this chemical related documentation, the first one is that brand restricted substances documents. That must be an updated list. Second one is the safety data sheets. In all chemicals, when we are purchasing or the purchase departments are dealing with that, they must get the safety data sheet from that particular suppliers of that particular chemical to understand the health and safety issues, the use of the chemicals, or what are the precautions we need to take about those chemicals. So, updation is very important in chemical related documentations, and that's why if we see in a nutshell that what about the chemical related documentation and what are the different aspects of it. So, first comes the SDS, that safety data sheet, then technical document sheet, then restricted substances compliance agreement or a documentation or an agreement which a particular supplier has to sign, and also the restricted substances test reports. This is also very important, because the substances which are restricted, that must be accompanied by a test report, proper test report should be there. So, that is why the management of this RSL compliance is very important here inside a factory. And chemical related documentation, we are talking that proper action plan is formulated through these chemical related documentations, and this action plan is to ensure that there is some phasing out of certain chemicals which are restricted, and not only the phasing out, but we have to substitute those chemicals with certain kind of chemicals which are not harmful and which are not containing the restricted substances. So, that is the proper action plan that will come from this chemical related documentations. So, that is the outcome of this documentation process. So, that proper action plan inside the factory can be formulated. Now, next important part of this RSL compliance is that screening of inputs for restricted substances. Now, what do you mean by the screening of inputs? Now, when you are talking about the screening of inputs of these restricted substances, we first talk about the chemicals which are supplied by the supplier, and a proper declaration first of all we should have. A factory should get the declaration from the supplier, then only they should purchase the chemicals or substances. Second one is important, that whatever chemicals are coming over there in the factory or after the application method, these substances that must be tested in the laboratory, and that must be a recognized third party testing laboratory. And then supplier declaration, as we are telling that it is very important that different chemical groups which are restricted, that should not be present in that particular chemical. Unintentional contaminations are very important here, because some of the contamination which are not expected, but due to the process it comes into the chemical formulation, that also one must be restricted. And this unintentional contamination talks about that manufacturing restricted substances list. So supplier declaration must contain that. And finally comes the testing of finished article for restricted substances. So after the finishing is over with that chemicals, that must be tested. So that chemical testing of that particular goods which are treated, that must be done, and that has been to be done in the finished state. So restricted substances list which is applicable, this is applicable in the finished product. So testing has to be done and it has to be monitored, and if there is any kind of restriction or chemicals which are harmful in nature we find, then there must be the reduction and elimination. Those kind of things are important while we are doing the testing of the products. There must be also a proper testing plan for the finished articles. Now what do we mean by the testing plan? Testing plan takes care of different processes or different testing which are to be done in this particular protocol of a garment, and it depends also upon the type of process, whether it has been dyed with some reactive dyes, or it has been dyed with some indigo dyes, or it has been dyed with the dispersed dyes. So based on that, the type of process, the testing plan has to be formulated. It also depends upon the substrate, which one we are using. Either we are using the cotton or the polyester or the blended material or any other fibers. Then the chemical, that is very important, what type of chemicals we are using. If we use the dyes, so what type of dye we are using, whether we are using any harmful dyes or any carcinogenic dyes or any allergenic dyes. So all these things are to be tested. So that comes under the testing plan. And if we want to really screen and test the document, so particular chemical formulations, so it comes on the fabric, it comes on the zippers or the different accessories or other components which are used in the formulation or production of the garment. So that must be tested, and testing should be done at the scale test of like a fabric test, then the zipper test or the accessories test. So all these raw materials are to be tested for these restricted substances or any other material which are the part of this. So after testing, there must be a proper database of restricted substances, and with this database only one can take the corrective action against the non-compliance which are found. So that is the root cause analysis we are talking about this, and we have to track the root cause of this, and we have to also see the past experience that this kind of chemicals when it was used in the garment, so what was the test results into that, and what are the chemicals used in these processes. So those kind of things are to be eliminated in this particular testing plan or restricted substances testing. And those non-compliance is an experience. One should not be overexcited about if any factory gets any non-compliance or if they get any restricted substances. They have to manage the situation, or they have to eliminate that chemical in a phased manner, and they have to replace it with some proper positive chemicals or chemicals which are not harmful in nature. So that's why prevent recurrence, all these precautions, if it is done, then we can prevent the occurrence of such kind of restricted substances in the finished garments. So this is all about the restricted substances and how these restricted substances compliance are to be performed, starting from the appointment of a compliance manager, then different precautions inside the factory. The documentation process is very important in this area. Purchase department has to be very careful. The declaration must be, we should get the declaration from the different suppliers who are supplying the material. Different data sheets are to be maintained correctly, and then finally the testing of finished goods, that is also to be done, and all the processes are to be documented. So then only a factory can be the RSM compliant factory. So thank you very much. We will come with the next topic in this particular RSL compliance, regarding the testing and their methodologies and what are the different plan can be made for different garments. Thank you very much.